I'm curious how you think about it. So let's say we have this family, there's a family inheritance coming from three directions and lots of friction, lots of tensions. If the money wasn't even there at all, would this family get along well, or the problems would be there? What's your take?
I love thought experiments like that. I will often say that money is like it's a huge amplifier,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like wax on wood. You're going to see all the beauty and you're going to see all the imperfections, and it's just going to come out more. So whatever's there
Right.
is still going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
It may not be as amplified.
Mm-hmm.
You may not have as many uh, reasons for discord, but if there's discord, it'll show up in other ways.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on the show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice.
My guest today is Emily Bouchard. She understands the unique challenges families experience when it comes to love and money. She assists clients in effectively communicating about complex situations that are often emotionally charged. She specializes in step-family dynamics, multigenerational family meetings, rising generation leadership and education, family governance, and family business succession. Emily brings over 20 years of experience and training to her work with individuals, couples, and families. She's the founder of Blended Families Flourishing and Bouchard Bespoke Consulting. Along with her coaching and advisory roles, she's also a facilitator of transformative experiences with horses in unique settings. I do want to hear about that. How are you, Emily?
Hi, great. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's such a joy. I'm very curious about the work that you do. I mentioned to you that our worlds overlap because I work with affluent families and I manage their money and I look at their portfolios. And I happen to be in the rooms with many family members at different points in time. And I feel like there's a lot more happening than just the portfolio discussion. And there are certain emotions that come up. And just being, I told you, empathetic about it, thoughtful, aware, I think can enhance the conversation and solve some problems before they become too important. Before I ask you about the work that you do, you might know that I like to kick off those conversations with the early days. So I do have to ask you if you'll share with me more about your childhood upbringing and how you think that time shaped your relationship with money and also maybe the career path that you chose.
Yeah, I love that you do that. I think knowing the people that you're listening to makes such a difference. And I come to this work through some very personal, impactful things that happened in my life as a child. And one was that my mother had a aneurysm burst when she was 44 and I was 14, and died very suddenly. There was no symptoms, no warning. It was, there one minute and a coma the next. And it completely devastated and shifted the trajectory of my life, as you can imagine. And one of the most apparent things to me in the course of that experience was how little anybody was able to talk about what mattered most in any kind of meaningful way that was valuable. Like, it was just so lost. And I ended up studying child development and really understanding the impact of significant life events in teenage years and how that impacted you as a young adult. And I also, when I was 18, was invited to volunteer at a camp for children with cancer and their siblings. And I had remarkable experiences with those young people. And I was only 18, right? I was in the cabin with the teenagers, so they were my peers. And I learned so much from them about resilience, about your mental attitude and your mood having so much to do with your life experience. And, teenagers my age that had lost a leg to osteosarcoma, right? And then like having the best time playing with each other or envisioning their future and talking about dating. And it was such an amazing experience for me to have like this kind of emotional wound that happened in such a deep way, and then be with people like me that had a physical challenge and really got curious about what allows for resilience in life when you're facing traumatic events or difficult situations. And I ended up getting a degree in social work and focusing on marital and family therapy. And I started a coaching practice for step families. I became a stepdaughter when my dad remarried. I was actually a step-granddaughter because my mother's mom had divorced when my mom was 7. So I had a step-grandpa. And so I had a lot of experiences personally. And then I became a stepmom to 2 teenagers and got a chance to be on that side of the equation. And I started writing about it and coaching people. I started a group for stepmoms and a couples group. And I ended up being referred to a company called the Williams Group in 2004. And they kind of did some seminal research in this field and really worked with very successful, household name families in terms of how do you prepare the next generation for being successful with the wealth. And I ended up being hired by them, and I did 8 years of listening to these families and interviewing every member of the family, in-laws, kids, 16-year-olds and older, and I just fell in love with them and have been doing it for over 20 years, and it's so inspiring to work with people that can leverage their wealth in such phenomenal ways with their employees, with their communities, with the world, and I've never looked back from that. So it's an amazing thing. I never thought for a minute with 12 years of therapeutic camping and social work that I would work in this space, but it's where I ended up.
So that's how you found your way to this very specific field of not just family dynamics, but also family dynamics around money, especially if it's a multi-generational family or a blended family. We'll come back to it. But I want to ask a big picture question that's been asked many times, but I'm still curious. Why money conversations are both so important, but also so difficult?
Such a great question. How much time do we have?
Unlimited time.
I'll tell you, I was traveling around the country and around the world, actually, working with these families. And I got to the point where I would have these bizarre deja vu experiences where I would leave one meeting in southern Florida, and I would go to the Midwest, and I would have the exact same conversation. And I would be like, wait, didn't your sister? It's like, I don't have a sister. It's like, oh my gosh, sorry. I started to get confused, and I really looked at, wow, I am meeting the most remarkable, unique individuals, and yet they're all having these same conversations and these same painful pain points. And that got me really fascinated about this question, and especially around this area of money. And so I ended up going and getting trained and certified as a money coach through the Money Coaching Institute, the Deborah Price, and learned about archetypal patterns related to money. And what happens is, we grow up and we have these things that we see, we hear, we observe, and we come up with these strategies for how to move in the world that'll keep us safe and keep us happy and get our needs met. And
Right.
these patterns shape us. And so you can have many people in the same family that same parents, same house, but they'll have different patterns, different ways of relating to money based on the meaning that they've made, based on the things that they've seen and witnessed, and their personality too. And because of that, we have different approaches to money. And it's very challenging when one person's approach is different than another and they're trying to have a conversation about it. So understanding what are the underlying motivations, values, concerns, beliefs makes a huge difference when you're having conversations about money. And if you don't understand that and you're just looking at the content, it can get pretty challenging pretty quickly. And I think because people don't have a experience in their lives of it going well, they tend to avoid it, or they tend to have a lot of emotion when they're having the conversation.
There's so many things that you brought up, and I was taking quick notes. But when you said that you were traveling around the country and you hear the same stories, I kind of see it from my perspective working with families. But flipping on its head for a moment, when people experience something, they feel that they're the only ones that ever experienced it. It never happened to anybody else, right? And it can feel a bit isolating, thinking, well, I have to figure it out for the first time, because in the history of humanity, nobody has ever experienced it. And then you realize it's not entirely true. There are other people, maybe next door, going through a very similar experience. And maybe they don't talk about it. And around money, we tend not to bring it up. And we avoid it. It's easier not to talk about it. But through the conversations that you're having and I'm having, I realize those stories start to rhyme. And the beautiful thing is that they rhyme across continents, history, cultures. And they seem to be just human stories. They happen again and again and again. But the beauty of it for me, and I'm curious how you think about it, is that if somebody found a solution somewhere, maybe it's worth considering that this solution could work somewhere else as well, because it's the same story, just a slightly different setting. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I get to bring to the conversation is that normalizing aspect of it, which is, this is part of the human experience. And the narrative, the way that we move in the world, it has so much to do with the story we tell ourselves, and bringing that to light and really noticing that, this story I have is not, it's more universal than just individual. It's just such a relief. I mean, I can't tell you how many people, like within 20 minutes of meeting me or talking about what's happening, they're just, so grateful. Like, I didn't realize, it's like there's this peace that can come over them when they realize they're not alone. And I think that's why I've gotten more and more interested in doing more groups. Like, I started groups early on in my work, and the more you are connecting with other individuals that are having similar experiences and sharing how they've approached it or what it's like, it's so helpful. And it might be young people in a certain generation within one family system, talking about dating and prenups and like how different people handle different situations. It's so helpful for the cousins, and then they get closer as they're having to start making decisions together. That's a really wonderful aspect of the work, is that shared experience, and then also learning from each other. And wow, you did that, I could never do that, but I would do this. And it's like, well, that wouldn't work for me. But there's this way in which they could also expand, like, I didn't even think about doing that. So that's one. And then also peers from different families that have maybe businesses in very different industries, but they can come together and talk about what it's like to be a family member within a family business, and the incredible pressure that's on you, and how your identity is so impacted because of the name, and how you have to prove yourself in a different way, even though you might be really qualified. And it's such a relief to have other people that you can connect with and talk to. And it's also, it's like what do you call it, a first world problem, or, it can be very isolating because there's not a lot of empathy within the general culture for the unique and very real challenges that people with wealth face.
It's fascinating because with the wealth creation that we experienced in the last 100 years or a few decades, there will be more people with money being passed on. And quite a few clients that I work with inherited wealth. And I think more families will experience something like it in the coming years. And the conversations will come up, and the tensions will appear, and the solutions will be needed. And I think it's just fascinating. It's something that maybe 150 years ago was an issue just for the Vanderbilts. Just to exaggerate the picture a little bit, I think it's relevant for anybody. And even a small inheritance can create, quite a friction within a family. Before we get there, though, I want to ask you about a small family, a family of two, a couple. Two people meet, they want to be together. And at the beginning, you don't really talk about money. There are other things you want to talk about, more exciting things, seemingly. And at some point, the topic has to come up. So can you share with us what are the money conversations that couples need to have, and when to have them? You don't want to have them on the first date, do you?
Well, actually, the first date can actually be quite revealing.
Yeah.
Right? Somebody handles, if you go out to a restaurant, how somebody handles the check, or how they treat the wait staff, or what kind of tip they leave. Like, you learn so much about somebody by how they move in the world of money, or, what kind of comments they make about the pricing on the menu, or whatever it might be. Like, even those little nuances.
Hints.
And I always recommend pay attention. Like, don't ignore these things. That's actually really important information, because that person's showing you who they are. And then you also get to see who you are in relationship to it. And I'll tell you, having interviewed like thousands of people now that have married into wealthy families, I can tell you that the number one pain point is how the prenup was handled. If there's a prenup, or if there wasn't one. And that got me really concerned, because that there's seeds of resentment that get planted as you're getting married, right? Like, you're planning your wedding, and your future marriage is at stake, and then this happens. So I wrote this little pamphlet. It's like smaller than a Reader's Digest, about Beginner's Guide to Purposeful Prenups. And it's all about how, as a couple, you can strengthen your marriage by developing that muscle of having really healthy conversations about money. And you can use the prenup conversation to start it if you haven't been having it, because you're both in love. You both really want the best for each other. And it's a great time to talk about all those what ifs in terms of not just divorce, but death and disability. And having the chance to get to know each other and what matters to you and your values related to money is crucial when you're getting married. So I guess the 3 conversations I would say that you'd want to have right out the gate are, what are your earliest memories about money? What do you remember hearing, seeing, witnessing? What was the first time that you had a painful experience with money? Or when was a time that you experienced a gift being given to you where you were aware that money was involved in it? And what was a time when you gave a gift where money was involved? And what was something you saved for? Like, get the money stories from the family and from their own life. And really, we, in the work I do with families, we'll have everybody do like their money path, and they get to show their like significant memories along that path that really shaped their relationship and their values related to money. And those stories are so important to capture and to know about each other. And then when you have a conversation about money and something comes up, you can have that empathy and that awareness of where that person's coming from that has them feel so strongly about something or reactive about something. And then the other one is like identifying the values. Like, what are your core values that matter most to you, and how does how you spend and save reflect that? So behaviors that reflect the values and the motivation behind them. That's a really key one too. And so there's a lot of curiosity involved in the conversations, like not having a sense of judgment or better for how somebody should be with it, but more, who are you in relationship to this, and how can I best understand what had you splurge on this one thing but then not do that. I was talking with one client where they're like, my husband will go out and buy a new car like when our car is just 2 years old without even blinking, but I can't get him to use a new deck of cards. He will use a tattered deck of cards to play his game of solitaire that's falling apart, that is taped, and I get him a new deck and he won't open it. Like, Or he'll wear the same pair of pants and he won't wear the new ones, but he'll go out and buy a car. Like, what's happening there? She wanted to understand more about why it didn't make any sense. But for him, it made total sense. So that's like one example. It's like how it can be confusing, but it's because you don't understand the values that are driving those things. So
you touched on so many fascinating things. Very quickly, the idea of actually listening to somebody carefully, especially at the beginning where you're getting to know them, romantically or not, either way. I think it's just fascinating to actually listen to how they talk about things. And you brought up the restaurant experience and so on. I think you can learn a lot just because you observe their actions. And then and what you mentioned at the end, it's the idea of being penny wise and not so wise with the pounds or the dollars. It's something that I've heard so many times, and it's funny that you bring it up because I met people who are very particular about not spending the incremental cent on something, and yet they can splurge the large amount. And I haven't figured it out, and I'm sure there are psychologists out there writing about it and studying it, but I think a human mind, especially the one that experiences in the first 2 decades smaller amounts and gets used to the smaller amounts, the larger amounts are so abstract that they're very hard to handle. And it almost doesn't feel real. What do you mean $50,000 or $1 million? Or when people say $1 trillion, if you ask everybody real quick, how many zeros is that? I think you need a minute to think how many zeros is in a trillion. But we see trillions in headlines all the time, 2 trillion, 1 trillion. And the numbers are so large that I think our minds have a hard time grasping. I remember those stories from the old Wall Street when you had people that would come to Wall Street, make a successful living out of it, and so they would be very particular about spending little amounts of money, and then without much care they would send checks between buildings, and I'm talking 100 years ago, for millions of dollars with no security, just sending those checks to settle different payments. And it was just an accepted form of activity. That's what I read in books, so maybe somebody can confirm it. And I thought, this is exactly the same story. The million feels like such an abstract amount. Back then it was much more than it is today. And the pennies are so real because I can touch them, they're in my pocket, and I definitely don't want to part with them, right? I did something that I want to hold on to that penny. But yeah, I'll go out and buy a car. I think there's something fascinating there happening that I've heard more than once. I do want to ask you about the prenups because you wrote a wonderful book about it, and I'll include the link if you allow me so that people can explore it. But you bring up something in one of your writings that really made me pause and made me think. You said that there's something that's called financial infidelity, and it's the number one reason for divorce. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, that was really a shocker for me when I found that out. And I guess it goes back to your initial question about why is it so hard to talk about money?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is most people don't feel competent or confident in having those conversations go well, so they don't have them. Or they say what they think will, to go along, to get along, to allow for this kind of sense of harmony. But I often call it what Patrick Lencioni coined with artificial harmony. Like, let's just... I'll just say yes because I know that that'll make them happy when you have an intention of doing something different because it hasn't gone well in the past to actually be honest about how you feel or think about it. And so what happens is people will make financial decisions that are significant without including their spouse. And it can run the gamut. Like some people have a gambling issue, addiction, and they may run up huge credit card debt or leverage the house or like just different things. And so that's like an extreme. But then there's also the going shopping and not showing the spouse what you've purchased, right? Like, and it's been shown in like movies, and there's research about it too. Like this kind of, I think there was an article in the New York Times recently about like kind of the stealth shopping that people do because there's been such flack about what, you're buying another pair of shoes, or you need another Prada purse, whatever it might be, that it's like, well, I want to have it, so I'm going to do it. And because the finances are set up in such a way that there's might be either freedom to do it or there's a way that you need to be sneaky about it, it just becomes like this path of least resistance in the short term. And, you and I both love this analogy of the rider and the elephant when it comes to our brain. Like we have this rational, strategic, planful like direction of one side of the brain, which would be the rider on the elephant, and then we have this completely irrational, emotionally driven, like instant gratification other side of the brain that's the elephant, right? And which one's going to win? Well, the emotional side's always going to win unless you bring this really great passionate vision, motivation, energy, storytelling that has that elephant say, oh yeah, that's definitely the way I want to go, which is to not go the easy way out. And that's an incredibly important skill to develop. And I'll just say, like, if you haven't read the book Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, they take this research that was done by Jonathan Haidt, the happiness hypothesis was his book, and they made it so relatable in terms of Switch and how people use that thinking about our two different sides of the brain to affect change. Mm-hmm. So I highly recommend those. And so in the financial infidelity situation, couples that choose to go the short-term easy route end up destroying their marriage in the mm-hmm. long term because of the lack of trust. And that was the third piece about the conversations, is how do you build and rebuild trust within a relationship when it's been broken? So having conversations about when something happened around money where either you didn't tell somebody and you got in trouble, or you made a choice and it ended up being a failure, like really getting out like shame and mm-hmm. pain around money so that you can really understand and connect with each other around what might be more painful things. And then having a way of communicating when there's strong emotions is really important too. So developing some communication strategies and techniques can be very helpful. Like, don't have any money conversations when you've been drinking or you're on mind-altering substances or mood-altering substances. Not a good idea. And then making sure that it's a really good time of day for you, where there's time for it and where there's a time limit. Mm-hmm. I often recommend couples go on walks and have the conversation together. Having, like, when you're moving in the same direction and looking in the same way, it tends to help you have a more difficult conversation, and moving the body also helps. Uh-huh. But yeah, it's that lack of ability to talk about it that causes pretty devastating results in marriages.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can see how that can happen, especially if people marry later or become couples later and they have very established lives already, maybe with good income on their own, right? And then they have to merge the lives in some way. And it can happen that the lives become separate. Maybe some things are not talked about. If you add to it that one of them receives an inheritance, 20 years, let's say, into the relationship, that can also change the dynamic. And I mean, we can keep adding to it, but it can get very, very complex. Let's talk about prenups. When I was reading your book, you mentioned some misconceptions. And can you even share how many people actually have prenups these days? And explain why would we need them? How do they help? And how do you even bring it up as a conversation that usually sounds as very unromantic?
Yeah, I love changing that dialogue. So thank you for bringing that up. So a couple things are, a lot of people think if somebody brings up a prenup, it means you're planning for divorce. Mm-hmm. And it's just immediately defensiveness and offense. And I like to turn it on its head and say, your marriage is the most important contract you're entering into. And knowing what the exit options are is extremely important, because it's going to end by mm-hmm. death, by disability, by divorce, by disinterest. And by having these conversations and these what ifs when you are totally in love and wanting to be together for the rest of your lives is one of the healthiest things you can do. And the way, like, something that's very motivating is to have the sense of, oh, when these things happen, and it's not a question of if, it's a question of which one. Right. There's these lawmakers that have decided what the dissolution will look like, or what mm-hmm. the impact will look like. And do I want people that have never met me, don't know anything about my history or my values, determining what the end result is going to be for me and the people I love? Mm-hmm. You have this volition, you have this ability to do this deep dive into who are we, who do we want to be when we're together, and who do we want to be when we're not. while you love each other is such a gift to give to yourselves in terms of your marriage. And it's so important, especially when there is family money.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like part of the family money culture is that everyone gets a prenup. And then it's like this kind of, well, since everybody's doing it, we have to do it, or we have to fight against it. It's like, no. It's like, what's the value? What's the opportunity we have in this to strengthen our marriage, especially because couples tend to dissolve when they don't have a healthy way of relating about money. So why not use it as an opportunity to get really healthy and clear about what money means to us, what we want for ourselves, for our future children, for our blended family. And, because I work with so many step families, it's a huge issue because, you might have a step parent that's younger, that's living in the family home, but you want the family home to go to your kids from your prior relationship, and you're going to have kids with this new spouse, and it becomes very complex very quickly. And so being able to have those conversations and look at what is the best option for us and who we are and what we care about completely strengthens the marriage and the family dynamics too.
So this overlaps with estate planning, and I have kind of a two-layered question. I'll come back to it, but one of the questions I had, we have a couple here, we're talking about, do we do it together or do we do it separately? You wrote about it, and I want to hear about it because it's a choice.
Yeah, and it's so much to do with what you're coming with, and especially if you have like a trust that's going to go to you and then your blood-related offspring, and it's not going to include your spouse. Like right out the gate, you need to be totally upfront and set up clear expectations about that. I'm all about doing as much as you can together in terms of you coming to the place of mutual agreement about what it needs to look like. There are great mediators. There's collaborative attorneys that are doing collaborative estate planning, and doing your pre-work ahead of time. Like I love, there's so many things online you can use, or getting, working with a mediator. Or I worked with a couple that could not figure out how to get their prenup taken care of before their wedding, and the mediator was like, "You guys need help," and they found me, and they had to do some really interesting work around. He got into debt, and she hated debt, and she didn't want to ever be responsible for his future debt. And how did they look like as a couple getting married? And if they didn't have the prenup, the state laws would have had her be responsible for his debt. So there was a real need to have it, but they didn't know how to resolve it. And so understanding the values behind it and the motivations, we came up with a really creative solution that allowed them to she did a gift for him financially as a wedding gift, and he signed the prenup that he would not need or have spousal support, or she would have any interest in his financial dealings, because she's given him this gift on the front end. And so they were very creative in how they did that. So I think that that's one example of how you can really come together as a couple around what is it that are your goals for each other, what are your unique ways of dealing with money, and where does it work, where do you have overlap and it's really healthy, and where do you not. And then that helps you understand, like, how much are we going to blend our finances, and how much are we going to keep it separate, and how do we want this estate plan to look. And then also there's constraints based on maybe one's a business partner and has shares in a company, and that needs, because of the stipulations in the partnership agreement, it has to look a certain way, or because of trust from the family. So there's so many different aspects to consider.
So can we take it to the next level? And you kind of touched on it, and thinking of a blended family. People marry more than once, and there might be family members that join this new arrangement. What are some of the mistakes and some good practices that we should be aware of? And I know it's an open-ended question, but just to give us a flavor.
When I wrote the estate planning for the blended family book with former estate planning attorney Paul Hood, we wrote a list of like 11 reasons of fears why people don't do their estate planning. The biggest one for blended families is no matter what decision I make, somebody's going to be unhappy. Right? And there's this really big issue of fair versus equal. And so I'm all about managing expectations and taking care not to make promises or not to talk about things being equal when they're not. So it's really about like, what is the lay of the land here, and where do I have the ability to equalize things out? Where do I not? And then to what degree can I, or do I want to, and how much does my spouse want that? So it gets very complicated, especially when a second spouse, typically a gentleman will marry somebody younger and start another family. And then it's like, wait, what are the expectations and promises to the first family? What are the agreements from the divorce from that first family? And then what is it that you want for your new family? And it can get, even with the best of intentions, it can cause a lot of mischief and challenges. And so a couple of key mistakes that I always say on any interview I have is check your beneficiaries, because you may have the most brilliantly drawn up estate plan, but if you haven't changed your beneficiaries on your retirement accounts, your life insurance, your bank accounts, even the deed on your home, like whatever it is, it will always default to the beneficiaries rather than what you put in your estate plan. And so it's such a simple thing to do, and so many people don't do it because it's not urgent. And I can't tell you how many people have told me these awful stories of being a second wife and everything going back to the first wife, or everything going to the stepkids because of how the estate plan was designed, because the second to die had access to everything, and as opposed to the kids that it was meant to go to. Like, it can run both ways because it wasn't set up accurately. So that's the biggest mistake.
No, it's fascinating, and I'm sure it's an ongoing conversation as well. New family members might appear, and more people are involved, and you have to take it into account. Can we take it into another dimension over time? Multi-generational. We have the grandparents, parents, grandkids. And if you want, you can make it a blended family to make it more interesting.
Well, yeah, they're there for sure. There's going to be like divorces, remarriages, widow, yeah, all of it, yeah.
And even the timing of the actual money flowing to the next generation, I find it also fascinating, because on average, let's say, we do tend to inherit money later because people live longer. And I do witness that people receive an inheritance sometimes towards the end of their career. Like they're almost close to retirement, and then they receive sometimes a life-changing inheritance. And it creates a new, dynamic and new decisions. Do I retire immediately? Do I wait? And if there's a spouse involved, that also changes the dynamic as well. But I'm very curious about your perspective, multi-generational dimension here.
I think one of the things that I've noticed in my work that makes the biggest difference is when the generation that's the wealth holder takes the time to clarify and articulate what the stories were, what the values were that led to the creation of the wealth, and what their goals, visions, and hopes and dreams and concerns are for those that are going to be inheriting the wealth. And it's interesting because you mentioned the Vanderbilts earlier, and I was thinking, I think the first reference to what's called an ethical will is in the Bible. Like,
right.
This approach to actually saying, hey, I want to give you this, and I want you to benefit from it, and I want you to understand it. Like, I want you to understand what this is and what it's about, and not so much like a hand controlling from the grave, but more, I want you to know what this means. And the other side of it is that preparation on the part of the beneficiaries. So anytime somebody's named a beneficiary of a trust, it doesn't matter when it's going to be funded. That person's in a role that, when you're in a role in life and you don't understand it, it becomes this abstraction, right? So it's very hard to relate to it. So I'm a big proponent to, as a chief learning officer, in terms of helping people learn about the roles that they're in or they're going to be in, and how to be the most effective that they can be. So, oftentimes they'll think, we want more engagement with the next generation. It's like, well, do they understand their role as beneficiary, and do they understand what is expected of them, and also what they can expect from it? And articulating those things is so important, and then providing them an avenue to like co-create their learning process. That's something I really love doing, is where they get a chance to, okay, we need to educate them. Well, what are they interested in? And there's so many different avenues it could go in, but how do you use what they're interested in to then make it so that they're motivated and interested, engaged in their learning process?
You brought up the next generation, and I have to ask, and I know there's no formula, but there's a certain point that you have to, well, you might want to reveal that there's money coming. And sometimes the kid can just look around and see there's definitely... So there's less of a hiding. But I think that happens quite a bit from what I've noticed in the first generation wealth creators. The later generations tend to be more modest in showing the wealth. So maybe the child might be surprised that there's anything coming, especially if the parents have professional careers that are not big income producing careers, yet they receive an inheritance, so it kind of blends in. They don't know why they can go on those very expensive trips, and kids can maybe figure it out. Long story short, when do you tell the kids?
Yeah. So I'm a big proponent for as soon as they're able to understand it. And money is such an abstraction that they're paying attention all the time. Like they'll say, well, let's just go buy this. Well, I don't have any more. And it's like, well, we can just go to that machine and get more cash out of it. Like they are paying attention all the time, little ones. And the more you can have and articulate healthy conversations about money and build that understanding and awareness about it, the sooner the better. So even at age 5, you can start talking about philanthropy and giving back. And you can help them understand the value of things. And kids love it, when they're really trying to understand money and stuff, and like showing a child at the grocery store that you can see the price of something, but then you can also look more closely and see how much you're paying per, serving or per ounce or whatever it might be. And I love using their little eyes. Like, look, my eyes are not good. This is written in really small print. What does that say? And so then they can look at, look at the different sizes of those bottles. Oh, that's the same amount, but which one looks like it has more? And which one are you paying more for? So you get them thinking critically about money in real life situations. And then you have to be aware that they're observing you all the time, right? So if you've just gone on a shopping spree and they're seeing that you have, 3 more purses and 6 more pairs of shoes, and they're paying attention to that, and they're going to want to emulate that and dress up in your clothes and have your purses. And so it's like, how do you have them see, like, because you work so hard, you're able to buy these things. You don't just get them because you want them. Like, so you can have those kinds of conversations. And then if it is because of an inheritance, you can talk about, like, we're able to benefit from these things, other people can't. And we also want you to know what we've been given to. Like the same amount of money I spent on these purses in the shopping spree, I also gave to the homeless shelter in our community. And I'm really concerned about the food and the lack of food that they have. So we're doing this volunteering effort. So you're bringing overtly awareness about what's happening, as opposed to having it be like hidden from the children. And then I always talk to people that are hesitant, and I don't want to tell them, I don't want them to know. It's like, okay, so if I went on Zillow right now and looked up their grandparents' house in Vail that you guys go skiing in, or I, like what it looks like to rent a private jet or own one, like if they've been on a private jet, what would their best friend find out? Like, what would a bully at school find out? Do you want them to have that information from that source, or do you want to manage the narrative and help them feel really empowered when they encounter that in the space that they're in? Because children find out all kinds of information, and you want them to be equipped for when they're hit by their peers. So.
I like the way you put it, and I was thinking how we can show how to interact with money, and with those little behaviors that you mentioned, kids can observe and see, that's how you think about the purchase. I'm good friends with Jay Hughes, who you might know.
Jay's
and
amazing.
he shared a story with me that I think you would appreciate. You might know it already. How when parents are shopping with a child, there's a choice. What are you going to say? And it's so easy to say, we can't afford it. even if we can afford it. And Jay told me you could say we choose not to buy it. And it really stayed with me because on so many levels it's more empowering. It's our choice, your choice. You chose not to have this toy today. And second, I think it's more accurate depiction of the family situation, and instead of saying you can't afford it, which is probably not true, you could probably afford it. But it sets a whole different tone. It empowers the individual to decide. And then if you still want to have it, then we'll buy it. But don't just say we can't afford it.
And when you want to be in integrity, children will absolutely know if you are saying something that's not true. And so you want to be in integrity. So if you could afford it and they know that, and you say we can't, you're actually setting up a degree of distrust and also a strange dynamic with money for them. So I'm always about err on the side of being open and honest about it, but you don't have to give all the details. It's like, yeah, we could afford that, but we're going to choose not to. And the other thing that's brilliant is families that use the share, save, spend model, where the children have access to funds and they have it in these 3 different containers. And when they're little, it's great to have it be physical and they can feel it and see it and touch it because it's concrete and that's what their brains need. And then you can go to an app, and there's wonderful apps for it. And then when I want this, and it's, oh, well, how much money do you have in your spend? And it becomes their money. It suddenly has a different value than if it's their parents' money they're spending. And that's a wonderful thing to build, to have them. You could choose to spend it on that, but I thought you wanted to save some of that money to buy that other thing that you said you wanted. So you're helping them think critically about the instant gratification versus the long-term goals and results that they want.
Well, speaking of delayed gratification, I have to ask you, I had a guest on the show, Oliver Berkman, who writes about time. And he brought up the Stanford marshmallow experiment. And the conversation went in a direction I didn't expect, but I'll bring it up to you. But he says, those kids, and I actually met in real life somebody that was part of that experiment at some event, and a very successful individual. And the idea was that obviously, if you delay gratification, you in some measure or form, let's say you're more successful in life, to keep it very simple. But the point he was making is that those that can wait for the second marshmallow, they could also wait for the third one and the fourth one and the fifth one. And what he was trying to capture, if I'm describing it accurately, is that we derive pleasure from the waiting so much, the saving or investing, however you want to, that we might not even want the marshmallow at the end. And when you really look at people that have billions of dollars, and let's think of Warren Buffett. He enjoys the process of investing so much. And I think he's the master of delayed gratification since he was 4. I don't think anybody can get close to him on many levels, including that one. But then I was thinking about, and I'm in the process of writing a little essay about it, when do we learn the joy of spending money? How do you think about it?
That's a great question. I want to say one other nuance to what you were just describing is those that delay, and let's say they get 10 marshmallows instead of 1, their natural inclination is to share them.
True.
And to want to be able to share this bounty with others. And there's like few things that give us that sense of like happiness and fulfillment, as in finding that we can do that and we can amass this kind of abundance and then being able to share it with others. So I wanted to offer that too.
I love that.
Yeah. And then I think that there are people I work with that both ends of the spectrum, like either a habit around spending, which is a sense of they can never have enough of what they don't really want. So they're spending off the charts because they think that's what it's that dopamine hit of the purchase, but then it doesn't give them the sustained gratification and happiness that they're looking for. And then there's the people on the other end of the spectrum that they have real challenges with enjoying and spending and increasing what they have with the money they have, and there's emotional belief systems behind that keep them from doing that. So helping them develop a very healthy relationship with money on both ends of the spectrum is something that's really gratifying for me, because it's like if somebody's able to do that, and it's not just spending, it's giving too. I worked with one woman, phenomenal person, who cared so deeply about the environment and really had some serious passions that she wanted to be able to have an impact in, and always lived a middle-class lifestyle, lived in the same home for 50 years, and they amassed, they're a billionaire family.
Mm-hmm.
And getting her to give more than $10,000 a year to go up to $100,000 a year, I mean, that's a tenfold increase for her, but it's still a drop in the bucket to what we were trying to get her to go do, that would make her feel so much better. But we had to work with her values and her sensibilities and where she came from, and even the giving of that amount of money was extremely difficult for her. But now she's gotten to the point where she's able to, and she's just so much happier. But we had to move through a lot of internal resistances, and it wasn't there's no shoulds. It's more there was this disconnect between all the impact she wanted to have and then what she was actually doing.
So many thoughts come to mind. I'll briefly mention something personal, that my wife says that I'm more eager to treat somebody than I treat myself to something. So when I have 10 marshmallows, I'll find 10 friends that need the marshmallow more than I do. That's just my personal quirk. I want to bring up Michael Sonnenfeld from Tiger 21, who was a guest on the show. And he brought up a story towards the end of the episode, if somebody ever wants to look it up. And we're almost done recording. He says, I have a story for you. And we kept recording. And he says, I had a member of the club who was giving, as you mentioned. And the amounts that he was giving, proportionately to what he had, were relatively little. That was Michael's observation. So he asked him why. And he says, well, it's more than my parents ever gave in a year. He was comparing himself to his parents that he gives in a month. But then Michael said, but you have so much more than your parents ever had. And it allowed this person to reframe the giving. You know, it's not just what your parents used to give, but proportionate to what you are able to give, right? And it could be a much larger amount. But it's interesting what you said, and I really love that the ones that collect the marshmallows, at some point they want to give them out.
Yeah, that's you, for sure.
And there's something about that. I do want to bring up one more thing. I had Jordan Grummett, who is a hospice doctor and who writes about financial independence, but also about meaning and purpose. And he brought up something that really struck a chord with me and rhymes with what you were saying a minute or two ago. He says that people that reach financial independence, whatever that number is that allows you to never work again, once they reach that point, they don't know what to do next, because reaching that goal was the purpose in itself, the number. And once you get there, and then until they get there, everything, they compromise, they wait, they postpone travel, they might stay longer in a job they don't like, because there's a goal. And when humans have a goal, we can go really, really far in uncomfortable shoes, right? We can make all those sacrifices. But once you get there, what do you do next? That's why I brought up the idea of developing a joy for spending or giving some of it as you go. Because once you reach that moment, you might not have the skill or the appetite needed to do something with it, right? Just having it, it's not enough. I want to bring up something that you mentioned, and I do want to forget it. You said fair versus equal. And it really struck a chord with me. I remember a story of a Gilded Age millionaire, and I'm forgetting who it was, who had daughters. And he decided, which was unusual at the time, to leave it equally to all the daughters. You might remember who it was. Maybe it's going to come back to me who it was. And he thought this is the least, in my interpretation of it, was that this will cause the least conflict. But then you say fair doesn't equal, fair versus equal, it's not always the same thing. Can you share a little bit more about it? Because it seems like, it's $1 million, we'll divide it 4 ways, everybody should be happy, but it might not be enough to avoid conflict.
Yeah, it's a good question. And some parents are like, no, it's going to be equal across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And what we know is that people are really unique and individual, and what may seem to be the fairest thing is to give it equally may not be. there may be somebody that has very profound special needs that might need financial assistance in the course of their life in a way others might not, and also probably wouldn't benefit from having direct access to the money, whereas somebody else who's shown competence with money and has made money on their own, it would make more sense for them to have more freedom and maybe be their own trustee. So like that's one simple example. I can tell you a fair versus equal story from a stepfamily situation that I worked in, where they couldn't sign their documents because they had this impasse in terms of what it should look like. And he was the father of 4 children, 2 from one marriage, 2 from his current marriage, and he wanted all 4 treated equally. And she was the parent of 2 and wanted them treated fairly because her 2, she was their mother, and the other 2 had another mother who had resources. And she thought it was very important that they not be treated equally. And yet he came from a situation where his stepmother had treated him differently than his siblings, and he was given less, but he was put in a trustee role or an executor role. And it was a horrible situation for them as brothers. And he didn't want to put his kids into that situation. So he had a very strong motivation for keeping it the same. And she had an equally strong motivation for bloodline being extremely important and having it be fair, based on her relationship with her father and different things from her life. And so I worked with them to find out where their values overlapped, where they were totally in sync with each other, and then where these differences were clashing, and how to expand their thinking in terms of a creative solution that would allow for both and they did. They came up with a really creative solution based on her earning potential versus his, and it wasn't a significant enough number that he was okay with it being that much less that would go to his 2 that were going to get money from their mom as well, that as opposed to the 2 that he had with her. But the most remarkable thing that happened from this was they chose to have a facilitated conversation with all 4 of their adult children around how come they came up with this estate plan the way that they did, and to explain why it was not equal and why the process that they went through, so they got to really understand the whole story and everything that went behind it. And then they included them in the conversation around. They said, we haven't signed the documents yet. This feels really good to us. We want to know what, if anything, is impacting you about this. And what was phenomenal about it was one of the older children remarked how their stepmother was closer in age to them because she was younger than their father, and that they expected her to live a long, healthy life, and that it was extremely helpful to know that they didn't have any plans to do any lifetime giving, and the way it was set up was they were probably not going to experience an inheritance. She might even outlive them, right? They did those kind of what if scenarios, but from a place of gratitude, because I'd done some coaching and prep work with them beforehand, so that they could make really good decisions about their planning, their kids' college educations, their retirement planning. And it opened up a whole conversation around lifetime giving that they had never been open to before. Like their advisors had talked about it, and the 529 accounts and different things you could do. And they were like, no. And then when they heard this, they heard it in a different way. They're like, wait, we can totally pay for the grandkids' college education. Like, how do we? So then it opened up this whole other possibility for the family. And I use that to illustrate the point that when you take the time to come up with what feels really fair and right for you, and then communicate it with the family, results might happen that you might not have even considered. And the more people are included and informed about the process and why, the more likely it is that they're going to be behind it. They're going to value it. They're not going to fight it. They're not going to end up in litigation afterwards. But the opposite is true. If you don't say a word about why you've designed your estate plan to be fair in your mind versus equal, the likelihood of it going into litigation is much higher because of presumed expectations or promises or understandings about what it's supposed to look like. So that's what I can do to illustrate the fair versus equal for you.
And I love the sound of that, and there's a lot of nuance to it, and I appreciate you showing an example gives us a flavor. Having worked with families for the last 20 years, I do appreciate when the family gets along, my work is possible. And if the family doesn't get along, the work can get to the point that it's not possible, right? And I think I do appreciate the two ends of the range here. And if people can talk and feel like they're included, and we talked about the multigenerational aspect, the younger generation is included, they're aware, they're in the room, they can listen, and at some point they can speak up and share. It's important. If it's a blended family with different interests and across multiple ages, it's very important for everybody to be involved. As we're talking, I do have one more question. Well, two really. One relevant to the point and one big picture question. There's a moment where, when we're talking about money quite a bit. And just as a mental experiment, I feel like let's remove money from the equation. Does that solve all the family problems? And I kind of know the answer, but I'm curious how you think about it. So let's say we have this family, there's a family inheritance coming from three directions and lots of friction, lots of tensions. If the money wasn't even there at all, would this family get along well, or the problems would be there? What's your take?
Well, I love thought experiments like that. I will often say that money is like, it's a huge amplifier, right? It's like wax on wood. You're going to see all the beauty and you're going to see all the imperfections, and it's just going to come out more. So whatever's there,
right,
is still going to be there. It may not be as amplified. You may not have as many reasons for discord, but if there's discord, it'll show up in other ways. Yeah.
So to say money is the problem, it's not entirely true, because the problem might have been there, or many of them, and money just brings it up to the surface and becomes almost like the target and excuse to create an expression of it in a way. And you said amplify. I think it's a beautiful way to put it, because there's something at stake. It's not just who is hosting Thanksgiving. It's much more at stake here. And a lot with it comes up, and a whole history with the money itself, how it came about and what it means to different family members, and who made a contribution, who feels like they made a bigger contribution to it or didn't make it, and on and on and on. It's an endless conversation. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, one of the things that can happen that causes a lot of mischief in families is when the love and the money get conflated. So you see it a lot in blended families when a parent feels guilty that they weren't there as much as they wanted to be, or that, then they or maybe a really successful entrepreneur that's been having to be so focused in the business, and so they use money and gifts as a way to somehow assuage their guilt, or whatever it might be, and so that creates a whole setup there. And then there's also the unmet expectations around. Wait, you've been giving me this check every year because it's for taxes, but if I don't get it, then I have this expectation of getting it. I was planning on having it, but I can't ask about it because that seems like I'm greedy. Like, there's so many things that are involved in it, and our financial and legal institutions have done a lot to make it so that money becomes a big part of the relating within the family system when you have a lot of it, in terms of for tax mitigation purposes, as opposed to, wait, what's really good for the family, and how's this plan going to impact the family? I mean, Jay's wonderful talking about that.
He really is, and I think he's the one that told me about the idea of a gift with warm hands. When you're giving something, make sure that it's done with warm hands. I think it's very, very important. And what you bring up, it's also fascinating, because at some point you might think that the money is the hero and the most important part of the conversation. It has to be, you have to consider the taxes and the investment choices and all of those things, when you forget, well, it's supposed to serve somebody, right? And yes, we have to take into account all the other things, but at the end of the day, it has to have a positive impact on the individuals involved. And maybe it will be at a higher tax rate, maybe it will be a less optimal investment choice, maybe it will be a compromise on other fronts, but individuals involved are at the heart of it. And Jay talks about the souls under management. Like, the whole profession is so obsessed about assets under management, but it's really the people. And I'm much more curious about the people. Yeah, I do want to know more about the portfolio, but tell me more of how it all fits into your life, and what can we do to make it a positive impact for everybody involved. I have one last question, and it's a big one. What's your definition of success?
Such a big one. I ran the Institute for Family Success, so it's like I really dove into this question a lot because it's like, what is it? And I'll share my orientation towards life, which is if I see somebody who's homeless on the street, I don't think about what happened to all their money. I think about what happened to their relationships. And, money is an energetic force in the world. It's not going away. There's highs and lows. You can have a huge amount. It could be gone tomorrow. There's so many different things. It has everything to do with all the other capitals that Jay talks about, right? Mm-hmm. The human capital. Who am I in relationship to whatever my life circumstances are? The intellectual capital in terms of where's my ongoing lifelong learning and approach to life so that I'm resilient? My social capital, right? What's my network? Who are the people that I can reach out to in a time of need or if there are challenges? And then also who can I support in that area and leverage what I have to make even greater impact? And then the spiritual capital, right? Am I connected to something larger than myself? Am I aware of what my actions are going to do 100 years from now in terms of the world and what's happening? And that larger, broader perspective and the care of the soul, like what you were just saying. Mm-hmm. And so the financial capital it's so often given the majority of the focus when in reality, if you don't have those other four, it doesn't matter how much money you have. So that's my definition of success is somebody who's extremely well-rounded in all five of the capitals and is cultivating the kinds of relationships that make life worth living. Yeah.
I love it. That's a beautiful aspiration for all of us. Emily, this was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, and I'll share the links to the resources that you brought up. And I think this audience will greatly enjoy everything that you shared. And you proposed a whole different dimension to the money topics from all the different angles that a lot of us might be facing. And maybe until this conversation, this episode, people thought they're the only ones in the world. And hearing you, they realize, no, there are others. And others figured it out. And we can all figure it out. And it's not easy, but it's doable. Emily, thank you so much.
Thank you.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show.